A few years ago, Bob Dylan sold the publishing rights to his music for a reported $300 million, though some sources say the number is closer to $400 million, to Universal Music Group. Dylan is one of many musicians who have sold these rights, typically to private equity groups. Why would companies invest such eye-popping numbers for the catalogs of aging rock stars? The same reason they invest in everything else. They believe it will make them a tremendous amount of money. Is that belief well placed? We'll take a look at some numbers, business trends in the music industry, and make some predictions of what the next 75 years or so may look like for aging rock stars and music in general. Assume you had $300 million lying around. Also assume that you didn't have plans for the money, but wanted to make sure that you had enough to live comfortably and to pass on to your heirs. There are a few investments that you can make, and again, please remember that none of this is financial advice. One of which is simply parking your money in the stock market, which is going to return about 8% annually if it follows historic trends. If you deduct taxes and normal inflation, your return is going to be about 4% of your total, or $12 million. Now, let's assume that you're a business and want to maximize your returns. You look at the 4% and scoff because you want more. Instead of the 8%, you think you can get 10%. Because this is more of an active investment, more on that in a second, you need to generate a lot more money to get to a pre-tax, pre-inflation return of 10%. On a $300 million investment, if you generated $40 million a year, you'd still have costs associated with the revenue. Sales, management, operations, etc. In the case of UMG, they almost assuredly will also have lawyers, salespeople, and a team to track what has been licensed and what hasn't been, by whom and when, as well as any and all parties who may infringe on their copyright. Dylan's deal with UMG includes, per a BBC article, 600 songs that this team would manage. My guess is that you would need a team of approximately 20 to 40 people to do this work. This is obviously a swag, but let's say that a team of this size costs about $8 million a year between salaries, benefits, office space, travel, and other expenses. Your pre-tax, pre-inflation earnings is now $32 million, which puts you at a return of right around 10% pre-tax, pre-inflation. 10.67% if you wanted to be precise. Some notes. Many of what I write below are based on averages. For superstar artists, these averages may undercut the value that they are able to command based on their status in the industry. Bob Dylan is arguably the most respected songwriter since they started recording music, so he's likely to be on the higher end of these deals. I'll try to take this into account when doing my maths. A lot of what I will be doing is Fermi and estimating, so take that as you will. For those unfamiliar, this is a methodology often used by consultants to, using available information, try to come up with viable or likely answers. These are going to be rough estimates, and none of what I write here should be taken as industry insider information. I'll post my links in the show notes where I cite hard numbers. The exact contract details have not been made public, so there may be exceptions to some of the below, especially when it comes to when the contract goes into effect, if Bob himself is exempted from paying royalties on his own songs, if he has any say in approvals, etc. My examination of this is based upon normally how this would happen. Current copyright law allows holders of rights to be compensated for 70 years after the death of the artist. After this point, the works are entered into the public domain and this entitlement expires. This is important in estimating why this is or is not a valuable investment. The longer that Bob Dylan lives, the more valuable this asset will be, simply in part because they are getting paid royalties when Bob performs his own songs. This may be offset if Bob is unwilling to use his songs for certain purposes, ads, etc. We do not know if Bob has final say on sync rights, for instance. In order for this investment to make fiscal sense, you would need to generate quite a bit of revenue. What are some of the ways that UMG can capitalize on this? The biggest are the following. Per ChatGPT, songwriting royalties when Dylan's songs are performed live by any artist, mechanical royalties when his songs are reproduced, e.g., on CDs, vinyl, or digital downloads. Synchronization fees when his songs are used in movies, TV shows, or commercials. Let's start with live performances. If, for example, Guns N' Roses are touring and they play Knockin' on Heaven's Door, UMG gets paid. How much they get paid fluctuates. The numbers I found indicate that the performance royalty range differs pretty wildly, but if we use 5% of ticket sales as a good rule of thumb, we can make an estimate. Say ticket prices average $100 and they play to a crowd of 30,000. They would gross $3 million a night. 5% of this would be $750,000. Let's say this is 1 out of 20 songs in the set, so UMG would be entitled to 1/20th of $750,000 or $37,500 per show. This would obviously be on the high end of royalties of this kind. Let's try and put some numbers behind this using intuition and Google. The top 100 tours grossed $9 billion in 2023 per an article in Radiant. This was up 46% from the previous year, so I'm going to use $6 billion for my baseline as a normal year. Let's say that in a normal year, 1% of the top 100 tours had a single Bob Dylan song in their set. Obviously, not all tours are created equal, but let's just assume 1% of $6 billion is $60 million. Again, assuming a 20-song set list and assuming that there's a single Dylan song in the set and assuming a 5% rate for performance royalties, we come to 5% of $60 million, which is $3 million divided by 20, which is $150,000. I'm going to double this for any and all revenue of this kind of touring outside the top 100% for $300,000. We also have to add in the money from musical theater. Currently, there is a jukebox musical called Girl from the North Country. For those who are not Dylanologists, this is the second musical in the last 20 years to be based on Dylan's music and lyrics. It is currently touring and appears to be a hit. A tour typically lasts over 2 seasons. In this case, there have been 125 or so performances. So let's use 60 a year as our annual estimate. One of the places it is playing is a venue in New Orleans that seats about 2,500 people. Let's say that the show's average capacity is 90% and the average ticket price is $150. That's 2,250 sold seats at $150 or $337,500 a night in revenue. That works to $20.25 million a year. If UMG gets a 5% cut of this, again, remember that 5% of the fees for live performances is split between all songwriters. In this case, Bob Dylan wrote all the songs for this musical. In this case, we can estimate the revenue to be roughly $1 million a year. Finally, before we move off of live songwriting royalties, let's look at Bob himself. In a normal, non-COVID year, Bob Dylan plays a lot of shows. So much so that his touring schedule has been described as the never-ending tour. His latest tour, the Rough and Rowdy Ways Tour, has lasted 3 years, covered 3 continents, and will be a total, once finished, of 231 shows. Let's use 75 shows as a normal year for Bob. For this tour, he plays theaters, festivals, and arenas. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to say that the average venue size was 3,000, and that Bob sold about 90% of the tickets at $150 each. This would give us a gross of $30 million. Taking our 5% cut, assuming that Bob plays a set entirely of his own songs that are under the UMG agreement, we would have $1.5 million. This puts our live performance rates at around $2.8 million a year. Not shabby, but also not great when looking at the overall size of this deal. You may be asking yourself, won't this revenue stream dry up once Bob passes away? Well, yes and no. A few things could happen that could replace this revenue. 1, the David Bowie route, and 2, the Penn and Teller route. There's a show called Celebrating David Bowie, which tours and plays the music of, well, David Bowie. The ticket prices look to be around the same amount, and the venues are about the same size. If you could fill out the shows and get some named performers to do this, I think you can make up the money this way, especially taking into account merchandise, which UMG would control. The Penn and Teller route is a bit different. This would depend on doing a Vegas residency, which would be higher cost but also higher possible upside. In this instance, UMG would partner with Sony, more on this later, to either lease or build a theater in Las Vegas with the goal of bringing in 1 million or so paying customers per year. The ticket price would be around probably $75 and would be a 2-hour or so show that would be the life and times of Bob Dylan American Original. It would be a celebration of his music using state-of-the-art technology and sound equipment to give tourists the best show possible, but would essentially be a video package of his music. With booze and merchandise, and possibly, should the laws relax, a troubadour's humidor with cigars and marijuana, sales could prove quite lucrative. Sony and UMG could also use this as a way to promote up-and-coming artists as openers for the show. Due to the upfront cost, this is unlikely, but given the numbers I laid out, you would be looking at $75 million in annual revenue. Let's say the show lasts 20 years with an annual margin of 20%. Both parties would split $15 million, so about $7.5 million apiece each year. I think this is less likely, but I was really proud of the Troubadour's Humidor line and wanted to make sure I got it into this episode. Before we dig deeper, let's take a break and hear from our sponsor. Do you enjoy reading but can't find book reviewers you connect with? Do you find booktubers more concerned with showing off their book hauls than reading to be as useful as solar-powered flashlights? You may enjoy another book review. It's a spoiler-free book review channel where I review everything from contemporary literature to classics, genre fiction such as sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, as well as a large dose of nonfiction. If you loved reading as a kid but fell out of the habit and are looking to jump back in, or if you never left in the first place, you'll find something to enjoy. That's Another Book Review on youtube.com. Per a Yahoo Entertainment article from 2024, Bob Dylan net worth 2024, how much money does he make? Writer Vriti Johar notes that every time his songs are played, streamed, or covered by other artists, Dylan earns royalties. His catalog generates an estimated $15 million annually in royalties, with over 6,000 artists having covered his songs, which contributes to a steady stream of income. Given the ubiquity of Dylan songs written or co-written on the radio that are covered by other artists, the aforementioned Guns N' Roses, Rod Stewart, Darius Rucker, Old Crow Medicine Show, this number feels valid to me. Two things to note. Typically, as time goes on, an artist typically grows less and less popular and is seen less frequently in the culture. The bulk of this is due to musical preferences changing, a lack of the ability for the artist to tour and remain in the public eye, and recording technology that tends to favor more recent artists at the expense of older ones. However, because UMG owns multiple record labels and has access to dozens, if not hundreds, of upcoming artists, it's likely that the vested interest of UMG may keep this number around where it is for a long, long time. How would they do this? As noted above, mechanical rights allow for a copyright owner to be paid when their song is covered, and this cover generates revenue either through album sales or radio or streaming play. UMG would benefit from an artist on their label recording one of Dylan's songs and that song being a hit. They would get paid whenever an album was sold, and they would get paid when that song was played anywhere. A successful A&R team could match the right artist to the right Dylan song, and the money would fall down like rain for potentially a very, very long time. See Jimi Hendrix's cover of All Along the Watchtower, which was recorded back in 1968, but still gets radio play to this day. The composition also comes into play when looking at streaming. In addition to getting royalties when Bob's songs play on the radio, with him singing them or not, UMG would also get a cut of the streaming revenue. I looked at Bob's Spotify streams, and it looks to be around 5 billion in total per the website Corb.net. This is the only place I could find these numbers, so take them with a grain of salt. I then looked at the total paid out to an artist per stream, multiplied these two numbers, then multiplied by 3. Spotify is roughly 1/3 of the streaming market, and then multiplied this number by 0.2. The royalties paid to composition rights holders are roughly 20%. I then divided this number to get a yearly number of roughly $500,000. I'm going to multiply this by 3 to encapsulate satellite radio and terrestrial radio. I'm going to say that Bob makes roughly $1.5 million from these revenue sources. Satellite radio is also a possible growth opportunity. At this time, Bob does not have his own channel like Springsteen or Tom Petty. Payout rates for satellite can be dozens of dollars. It's hard to find a single rate, but around $30 per spin seems to be in line with what I've seen. I could not find what the split is between master recording holders and songwriters, so I'm going to assume the same 20% split is above. If there was a permanent Bob Dylan station, and on the station 10 songs played an hour, let's say that 8 of them were songs he wrote and are covered under the UMG agreement, and 2 are someone else's songs, probably someone who influenced him. 8 times 24 is 192 times 365 is 70,080. Let's use $30 per spin. This gives us $2.1 million. 20% of this is $420,500 roughly. In the scheme of things, not a huge bump, but an avenue of possible growth for not a ton of effort. We also have album sales. In the US, the songwriter or publisher has a fixed rate per song of 12 cents per song. Meaning, if Bob sells 1 million albums that each contain 20 songs, we would assume that Bob would make $2.4 million in the U.S. I'm going to say that album sales each year for Bob are going to average 250,000. Why? I think physical media will continue to decline, and when taken over the long run, I believe that streaming will be the predominant way that people listen to music moving forward. This gives us an annual revenue stream of roughly $500,000. Finally, synchronization fees. This may be the hardest category to quantify for a few reasons. Here's where things get tricky. I didn't mention it above, but thus far we've been focused on what UMG owns: the publishing rights to most of Bob Dylan's music. What they don't own are the master recordings of Dylan's music. Sony bought these in 2021 for roughly $200 million. What is the difference? Most musicians are famous for writing and recording their own songs. Very few become so huge that their songs are covered by other people. Bob is one of those songwriters. His songs are both popular in the version he recorded and the songs are popular in the versions others have recorded. Sony owns the master recordings of Bob's versions, almost always the original versions. This entitles them to be paid anytime that a Bob Dylan song is streamed or bought. For example, if you buy a vinyl copy of Blood on the Tracks for $40, Sony gets a cut. When the version of Tangled Up in Blues gets used in movies, TV shows, or advertisements, Sony gets a cut. However, so does UMG because the composition was written by Dylan. Let me give another example to make this clearer. If you were, for instance, directing a movie about a group of high school students sneaking into a record plant in order to steal an early CD copy of Jay-Z's The Blueprint, and you are a hack, you may set this scene to the soundtrack of Alien Ant Farm's cover of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal. Jackson is the sole songwriter of this song. You would have to pay two different parties in order to legally do this. One, the holders of the master recording, Alien Ant Farm, or more likely, the label who owns the master recording. This is called a licensing fee. Two, the publishing rights holder, in this case, the Michael Jackson Estate or Sony Music Publishing. This is called a synchronization fee. Thus far, when looking at revenue for this deal from UMG's perspective, we're at around $20 million. For most musicians, this would be a very, very nice chunk of change. However, because UMG paid Bob somewhere between $300 and $400 million, they really should be trying to maximize their money, at least from an investment perspective. How are you going to make another $20 million per year? There is good news and there is bad news. The good news is that there are ample opportunities to place Dylan's vast catalog in TVs, movies, and advertisements. The bad news is that they will have to work hand in glove with Sony in order to do this. Why? As I mentioned earlier, Sony owns the master recordings for almost all of Bob's catalog. It's interesting to note here that anything that Bob records after these deals went into place are not covered. So, if inexplicably he scores a top 10 hit on his next record, neither party in this deal would benefit directly from it. Sony also owns a movie studio and will almost certainly try to place Dylan songs in movies. Because they own the master recordings, they will get paid if that version of the song is used. Sync fees are, as noted before, split into two parts. Sony holds one part and UMG holds the other. There's a conflict here. UMG would like to get paid twice. This would happen if, say, Sting's version of Girl from the North Country is used and not the original Dylan recording, which Sony owns. Sting is a UMG recording artist, and if they own the master recording, would get paid for the master recording and the use of Dylan's composition. This is important because sync rights can be quite lucrative. Here are the various platforms that can, as of this writing, be used to generate revenue. Global advertising campaign, single high-profile advertising campaign, sync rights for film, sync rights for TV, video games. Bob has licensed his music for a few ad campaigns as well as a Super Bowl spot for Pepsi. Let's try to put some teeth to these numbers and guess what it would take for UMG to clear the additional $20 million they need each year to make this investment a smart one. 2024 is probably going to be an anomaly for this deal. Why? There is a major motion picture coming out next month that is going to feature Bob's music in a major way. A Complete Unknown starring Timothée Chalamet. This movie is likely to feature a slew of Bob's songs and generate revenue that would not be seen in an average year. It's hard to say without knowing the details of the number of songs used in the film or what the specific deal for this particular movie is. However, sync rates have been increasing in recent years. This may be because copyright holders have realized how valuable they can be, or because they feel the single fee paid for sync rights in the past was too low, given how films and televisions now essentially exist in perpetuity. Per an episode of Freakonomics, in 1994, the film Reality Bites used the song My Sharona, and per the song's co-writer, they made $60,000 for this placement. Given this was 30 years ago and the stature of Bob Dylan, I'm going to say that the average rate for a film placement for Bob is $750,000 per song. Let's say this new movie uses 10 of his songs. That's $7.5 million, of which UMG would get half, assuming that they use Bob's original recorded version. The question then becomes, how many placements would have to be made across all media in order to justify this investment? A note at the beginning to be followed below. The below presumes a 50-50 split with Sony for any instance where a master recording is placed. I chose 50-50 because it is in both parties' interest to maximize revenue and keep the relationship working. There will be tension, more on that below, but this is why there is a 50-50 split for the revenue in this scenario. Ad campaign. Let's say that UMG is able to place Bob's music in 5 ad campaigns per year, both in the US and abroad, and that each of these ad campaigns pays out $750,000. That's $3.7 million. Again, we'll split this in half for Sony's cut. $1.87 million goes to UMG. I'm going to have a separate category here for a Super Bowl ad. Bob has been in one before, so let's say that every 10 years he is in one and the cost is $7 million, with UMG getting half. This averages out to $350,000 per year. Film. Let's say that UMG can place a total of 20 of Bob's songs in movies each year. This is like 4% of movies that are released in Hollywood every year. Nevertheless, it would net out $7.5 million and $7.5 million for the holders of the master recording rights, Sony. TV. TV is the biggest black box for me. I'm going to drop the number down to $100,000 for a placement, but I'm going to assume that there are more opportunities to use the songs. Let's say that they can place 50 songs a year. This is another $2.5 million in the pockets of UMG. Video games. I'm going to put this at around $500,000. I'm going to assume that this is pretty rare, as I know of only one example of this occurring. One of Bob's songs was used in a Rock Band video game. Let's say that there is a single placement per year, picking UMG up another $250,000. This estimate would give UMG revenues of $12.5 million, which is significantly shorter than the $20 million they were hoping for. Is there anything else that could possibly get them over the hump? Maybe. In a 2023 article from Grammy.com, yes, those Grammys, Bill Kopp writes, technology is also driving the widening of the market for sync. Complex and evolving concepts like the metaverse, virtual and augmented reality experiences, Web3, a next iteration version of the internet that employs token-based economic models, and NFTs, digital identifiers that can be sold or traded, are finding their way into modern life and popular culture, and sync opportunities are developing alongside them. We're watching the development of the metaverse closely and what they will bring in terms of more sync opportunities, says Wind Crowley, Sony Music Publishing Senior VP of Creative Marketing, Film, and TV. Robinson expresses a similar perspective and notes that at Warner Chappell, they're following the growth in NFTs and other technologies in the ways in which sync might figure into their futures. Robinson points to so-called microsync or micro-licensing for user-generated content like that found on TikTok as another potential growth market sector. This form of sync didn't exist a decade ago. The industry is clearly trying to figure out how to monetize music in these metaverses and virtual worlds, notes Griffiths, and music synchronization is finding its way into those media. It's hard to see Bob being big on TikTok, but assuming that virtual worlds become all the rage and this becomes a significant revenue stream, maybe it closes the gap. The other thing to note is that if UMG is able to place a Super Bowl ad, for example, with a UMG artist, assuming the UMG owns the master recording, they get paid twice. Once for the use of the master recording of the cover of the Bob Dylan song, and once for the composition, the publishing rights. This is true of all the categories above. UMG would like to get paid twice and would more likely than not push Dylan recordings made by their own artists as opposed to the master recordings of Dylan himself owned by Sony. If the working relationship forces a 50-50 split, but every once in a while UMG is able to place a cover where UMG owns the masters, they may also count as additional revenue as part of the Bob deal. As I understand them, most sync fees are paid out on a single flat fee basis. If there are any that are under a different agreement and Bob was getting a piece of the pie, based on revenue or number of airings and not a flat fee, this will likely continue to generate revenue into the future. Again, because I don't have access to the deal itself, it's hard to say how much could be here, but an example of this would be if PBS reran No Direction Home, the documentary directed by Martin Scorsese, and Bob was given a fee every time it ran based on sync rates, there would be an income stream here. I imagine this is quite low, but wanted to call this out. Before we wrap things up, where could I be wrong? Another way of asking this question is, what do UMG and Sony know that I don't? There are probably a few areas. The biggest chunk by revenue is artist royalties, and it's not close. What could change to drive this number even higher? UMG could utilize its clout to continue to get Bob Dylan songs on the equivalent of records, albums into the future. If some of these become hits, they likely will continue generating revenue for a long time. The other thing to note is that the political undercurrent in the United States is one of suspicion towards monopoly, and I believe that there is a growing trend to reevaluate areas where musicians have not been adequately compensated. Whether or not legislation will actually pass is another question entirely, but I would not be surprised if royalty rates were reevaluated sometime in the near future to the advantage of the copyright holders. The mechanical rate of 12 cents I noted above will go up in time with the consumer price index. However, given the decline of physical media, I doubt this will make a large change to the big picture of this deal. If, and I suspect that it will, live touring continues to grow, this stream will also continue to grow, given, of course, that Bob's popularity remains relatively stable after his passing. This is what I think UMG's strategy is, to turn Bob's songs into the great American songbook of the 21st century, to promote his songs with younger artists who will continue to play them live into the future. Remember, the royalty rate for live performances is based upon a fixed percentage of revenue from ticket sales. If ticket sales increase, this would, everything else being unchanged, also increase. I think this is a large growth area, and I wouldn't be surprised if this doubles or triples after Bob's death. Whether this is sustainable over the next 70 years is really the deeper question. Obviously, the sync and the sync rates are crucial to the deal working. I believe that we've seen peak media, at least in the streaming era, meaning there will be smaller budgets and fewer places to place needle drops. Also, as I mentioned at the top, there will be very heavy competition in this space, with Bob's deal being just one of many. All of these buyers, both record labels and private equity firms, are looking to the sync rights as easy money. Obviously, art is subjective, but when you have a shrinking number of buyers and an increasing number of sellers for a product that has many substitutes, the price typically goes down. I think this is a justification for the relatively large and well-paid team that will be managing this account. We also don't know what the media will look like in the future. I was skeptical earlier of Bob becoming a star of new media. It's important to note that two giant mega corporations have financial incentives in making him one. These corporations often have outsized influence on what the next stage of media will look like, and if they can include a Bob Dylan component and get paid to do so, then by golly, they will. There's a possibility that physical media could return. Sony, who have been on the vanguard of physical media for decades, may know something that I don't. Dylan has a very dedicated fan base, and as we've seen in the past with the switch from vinyl to CD, many music fans are willing to spend additional money for a higher quality product. If, for instance, Sony is able to put together a master box set that is everything that he has ever recorded and sells this in audio CD, super audio CD, vinyl, and digital, they would, I believe, be able to sell at least 1 million copies. The price point would be the hardest thing to determine, but this is probably core to them making their money back. UMG gets paid a relatively small portion of each physical album sale, the 12 cents per song. However, let's say that Sony is able to do this. They're able to sell 1 million physical copies of Bob's 600-song catalog. A check would be cut to UMG for $72 million, or roughly $1 million per year for every year that Bob's catalog is not in the public domain after his death. Given the numbers that UMG needs to hit, this would also not be a game changer, but would be a nice chunk of change for relatively little work. Remember, Sony has the incentive to sell as many copies as they can because this is integral to how they will make money on their deal with Bob. The other route here would be the Neil Young route. What would that look like? It would be a separate service for audiophiles who would pay a monthly subscription to access all of Bob's music for a flat rate, probably like $5 per month. The hook would be the quality of the music. Free lossless audio codec, or FLAC, is the highest quality standard currently available for digital audio. If Sony was able to get 100,000 subscribers, it would be a revenue of $6 million a year. I don't know how the digital rights here would work out, but they would also have to cut UMG some kind of check. Unlike UMG, Sony is focused less on Bob's songs than on Bob's recordings. This may seem like a minor distinction, but it's actually crucial to the strategy of both parties. Ultimately, do I think the UMG deal is a good one? Obviously, it's impossible to say without all the specifics. Part of the appeal of the deal, I believe, is that it would be classified as an alternative investment, as it is not stock, bonds, or cash. Thus, part of the appeal is that it would not likely follow the stock market, i.e., if there's a stock market crash, the value of this investment would not be directly impacted. On paper, it makes sense, but only if you believe that the artist royalty rates are going to remain unchanged and that the sync rates will be relatively high and the number of syncs will be relatively stable and easy to obtain. Like I said, I'm dubious because of the number of competitors in this space. I also think that over time, tastes change and that the biggest supporters of Bob, the boomers, are in their 60s. I don't think he has the cultural cachet with Xers that he does with boomers, and there are diminishing returns from there. One of the things to keep an eye on, and we probably won't know this until a few years after Bob's death, is the degree to which the sync rates resemble a Pareto principle versus a power law. The more songs that make up the top 80% of sync revenue, the likelier that the deal will have value long term. Unless the deal specifically forbids UMG from splitting up the catalog, they may try to spin off the chaff from the wheat if the market for most of Dylan's songs aren't worth holding them. I will reiterate that this is truly a black box. The numbers I put together are good faith estimates based on what I found on Google. If I am 2 or 3x off for any of my assumptions, the deal then looks a lot sweeter than what I've laid out. That being said, do the vast majority of people care who wrote a song that they like? No, they do not. They do not care, so it's hard to say how much of Bob's popularity is he himself and how much are the songs. That will be the true test here. Thank you for listening to this episode of Elegant Ramblings. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel on iTunes or YouTube. You'll be able to find show notes there. Hope you enjoyed. Bye for now.